All right, y'all. Well, first of all, thank you for being here. I always appreciate people taking time out of their busy days, especially during a pandemic, to be a part of something like this. So thank you so much from the bottom of my heart. My name's Ezra. I use they and he pronouns. I am the Director of Education and Outreach at Free State. And we have a lot that we're going to share with you today. And as Ash already shared, please do feel free to use the Q&A for any questions that you have throughout. We'll be checking it periodically to make sure that we don't miss anything. And without further ado, let's do it. So there's me wearing actually the same shirt right now as in that photo. And so just to get you a little bit more acclimated with who I am as a person, I have been involved with LGBTQ plus advocacy for almost a decade now. It is something I feel incredibly lucky to be able to do this as my full-time job. I've listed here a few other things that I've been involved in terms of LGBTQ plus rights. Outside of my work at Free State, I have been a member of the Baltimore City LGBTQ plus Commission. I was on the Law and Policy Committee. I also, if you know of the actress Angelica Ross or have watched Pose, Trans Tech Social Enterprises is actually her company. She founded that company. And so I helped with content development. I actually got to meet her a few years ago, and she is just amazing, as you would expect. And most importantly, I am a dog dad to a Chihuahua mix named Mango. Apologies in advance if you get to hear him barking in the background. Hopefully he does not. Hopefully he's sleeping right now. But that is a part of the joys of being remote. So that's a little bit about me, and I'll let Mackenzie introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mackenzie. My pronouns are she, her. I am a staff attorney with FreeState Justice, also helping with our intake program right now. I got my law degree from the University of Richmond School of Law, and I'm a member of the Virginia Bar, and I've gotten special admissions into Maryland with full bar admission pending. I unfortunately don't have any fun facts like working for actresses from Pose or being a dog parent. My prior work was with public defender's offices, but I have found my way up to Baltimore and into the LGBTQ advocacy field.
That did not go unnoticed that there was no mention of an animal or fun fact on here. So you better start thinking for next time. All right, so of course I want to tell you a little bit about Free State, just in case you don't know much about what work we do. Here on the screen, you'll see what I like to call our 3 pillars of work. And so probably what we're most known for, just based on our history, is the direct legal services portion. And so we work with a variety of cases that arise out of a person's sexual orientation and or gender identity. You'll see some examples here, such as helping trans and non-binary folks with name changes through the courts, discrimination cases on a variety of issues such as healthcare or employment. You'll see some more mention of health insurance below, as that is a particularly tricky legal field. Of course, from my title, you probably would imagine that I have a lot to do with the advocacy and outreach and education and trainings, and you would be correct. Right now, in terms of advocacy and outreach, the biggest thing that is the focus of a lot of our attention is policy advocacy initiatives. Usually we would be in Annapolis at this time, actually in person, advocating for various laws and policies. Unfortunately, due to the pandemic, it is virtual right now, and it is quite an interesting year to really navigate what that looks like online. I would love to talk about that sometime. It is wild, but full steam ahead. And of course, we partner with various LGBTQ plus like-minded organizations that are just interested in being allies. Places like Howard County Library System, huge shout out to them for having us here tonight. And of course, things like this, education and trainings, but that also applies to, really talking to service providers in particular and telling them best practices, whether that's therapists, housing service providers, you name it, we've probably talked to them. So that is just a little bit about us. And of course, please go to our website for any more information, which is freestate-justice.org. And so just so that to make sure that we're all on the same page here, we're going to share some LGBTQ plus terminology. This is by no means a comprehensive list and not the main focus of our conversation tonight, but just something so we can acclimate, and be on the same page. And so I will get us started off here on this round of terms that are thrown at you. And I typically like to use myself as an example because I feel like it's a little bit easier to kind of match the terms to different concepts. So when you first see the phrase birth sex, that is simply talking about what the doctor assigns you when you are born. Typically based on genitalia. The doctor kind of looks at you after you're born and says it's a boy or it's a girl, and that's what ends up on your birth certificate. So for me in particular, I was assigned female at birth is how I would say this, or I would say my birth sex is female. And so because, as you may be able to tell or guess from just knowing me and hearing what I care about already, my gender identity does not align with my assigned sex at birth. And so because I am more on the male or masculine side of things, and that's how I feel about my gender identity, that essentially means that the term transgender applies to me. The term trans really just refers to the fact that the birth sex and gender identity do not align with one another. They're different in some way. And so in terms of thinking about what gender identity is, it is something that I usually tell people to vision a brain, because it's something that's a deeply held internal sense of self. It's super important to me. It's important for how I view myself and how I navigate in the world. And so it's super important to respect and honor somebody's identity. So you'll see a little reminder as well that trans is an adjective. This is a common thing that sometimes gets mistaken. So for example, trans woman, you'll see there's a separation there. They're two different words. Sometimes there's the urge to put those all into one word, but separate is great. Transgender is also not a noun or any other, just an adjective. And conversely, cisgender is just meaning the opposite of trans. So it's if my gender identity and birth sex were consistent with one another, then cisgender would apply. And so for me, I already pointed out the fact that I'm wearing a button down with daisies on it. I love wearing florals and bright colors. I have longer hair. And this is all a part of my gender expression. It's really just how I decide to show off how I identify. And so it can be mannerisms. You'll see I also talk with my hands a lot. If you are looking at me right now, I still do it even though it's over Zoom and I cannot see any of you other than Mackenzie and Ash right now. It's still just a part of really how I express myself and my gender. And so I know that before I just hop on to the next slide, I know that this is a lot of stuff at once. So again, use that Q&A if something was still confusing, you want us to go over it again, anything like that, just let us know. And I'll turn it over to Mackenzie for the next one.
Yeah, so a few more definitions just before we dive into the main gist of the lecture. Gender expansive is a person whose gender characteristics or behavior don't necessarily conform to what you would think. So say someone who identifies as a man, but their characteristics, how they dress or how they act, someone might say, oh, those are feminine personality traits. A lot of that's socially constructed. Makeup, dresses, we associate with women, but historically that hasn't always been the case. So someone who might be gender expansive today, think of Harry Styles on his magazine cover wearing a very pretty long flowing dress. Non-binary, we probably should have bumped up a little bit so as not to have this with the gender expansive and with the identity. Ezra is non-binary. To continue with the example, a person whose gender identity is not exclusively male or female, including people who may not identify at all with either. Non-binary is often used as kind of a catch-all term, which some people like to think of gender as a spectrum between male and female and non-binary between that, but that's not really how it works. Non-binary just means not one or the other. And finally, sexual orientation is probably one that most of the audience is at least a little bit more familiar with. That's who you're attracted to. Um, and so just something to keep in mind, a person's gender identity does not determine their sexual orientation. So a cisgender person could like men, women, non-binary people. A transgender person could like men, women, or non-binary people. They aren't tied together.
All right.
This slide as well, sorry.
Yep, go for it.
So when it comes to trans people, a lot of times the conversation is centered around transition, and transition, it's important to note, is not the same for everyone. I've read articles talking about how back in like the early 2000s, you'd have reality shows where it was like, in order to transition, you have to do X and Y and Z. And there's some old websites and old psychology papers that talk about that, but that's really not how it is. Different people are going to go through different processes. Some people will change their names, some people won't. Some people will change pronouns, some people won't. Clothing, legal changes, medical changes, it's all very personal and very much something that that person has to decide what they do and what they don't want to do.
All right. So now we're going to start talking about kind of the context, give you some stats of why this is important, and then we'll start jumping into different laws and policies. So as much as I wish we had more recent data, unfortunately, the US Trans Survey from 2015 is still one of the most comprehensive when we're talking about trans folks in the US. I do know that the National Center for Trans Equality is planning on doing another survey sometime in the near future. The pandemic, amid other things, have delayed them quite a bit. So hopefully, fingers crossed, we can get some new data, if not this year, early next year. But as of right now, this still gives us, the survey gives us a great picture of into the lives of trans people in the United States. And so here you'll see some of those statistics there that really talk about how systemic discrimination can make it difficult or impossible for trans folks to live a quote unquote normal life or to just be able to meet basic human needs. So for example, on here you will see an employment discrimination, and according to the survey, over half of respondents reported hiding their gender identity or trans status at work to avoid discrimination. Then you see 30% reported being fired or experiencing employment-related discrimination. And these are some of the cases that we see at FreeState. And so the reason why I feel personally that it's important to share these statistics is, even though they are a little bit dated at this point, is that while we are making a lot of progress, and we'll talk about that progress, there are still a lot of hurdles that we are constantly working towards making non-existent. And so a lot of this is still very relevant and important for us to think about. You'll also see here inability to access healthcare is a big one as well, including in states where, in Maryland, we have various healthcare discrimination policies. This still is something that happens here. 1/3 of respondents of the survey reported at least having one negative experience with a healthcare provider, and 23%, almost a quarter, reported not seeing a doctor for fear of discrimination. So even if, let's say a provider is affirming and then welcoming to the community, a lot of times trans and non-binary folks have had previous bad experiences or just have an overwhelming anxiety of going to see their doctor, in general. So a lot of people are still dealing with this. I know myself included has a lot of this anxiety as well, accessing healthcare. And this is why it's important. And you'll see the source there down at the bottom, but if you just search NCTE 2015 US Trans Survey or something to that nature, it'll be one of the first thing that pops up. There's a lot more within that. They have different pullout reports based on race, for example, that also provide additional insight. So we definitely recommend you to check those out as well. And so normally we would let you kind of put in the chat what you think, but we do know the chat is disabled tonight, and some of y'all might be watching this as a recording on YouTube later on. And coupled with the fact that it's also 7:20 p.m. on a work day for most people, you know, I don't feel the need to make you write in the chat right now. So I want you to think about this and think of what you would answer. Based on US Trans Survey respondents, what percentage have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives? And then the options we put here are 10%, 20%, 30%, or 40%. And so I'll just give you a few moments to ponder that, think about what you would answer, and then I will let you know what the answer is. And I'll make sure I'm correct in it as well. And so if you are thinking that perhaps C, 30% is correct, you would be right. And so 30%, and now I think it's really important to think about how high that number is. 30% of US Trans Survey respondents have experienced homelessness at some point in their lives. And we're going to give you one more to kind of ponder and think about as well. What percentage of survey respondents said they would feel somewhat or very uncomfortable asking the police for help? So this one, A, 26%, B, 32%, C, 49%, or D, 57%. Take a moment to ponder. And you'll also see a little bit more of why statistics like this are important as we dive into the next section when we talk about how race also plays a role and exacerbates a lot of these statistics. And so if you guessed D, 57% for this one, you would be correct, which is an even higher number that is very concerning and again, still is persistent today. And so now we're going to talk about how transphobia kind of compounds when we talk about other identities. Over to you, Mackenzie.
Yeah, so one of the things that we often have to talk about in advocacy for trans people is intersectionality, where people have issues. For example, some people who are not trans are going to have problems created societally based on the color of their skin. For example, Black people are statistically more likely to be poor or homeless than white people. And then you also have, regardless of that, what we just went over, trans people are more likely to be homeless or impoverished than cisgender people. So when you have a Black trans person, those different forms of discrimination are going to combine and compound on each other. And so for any type of form of discrimination, it's always going to be continuously harder for different ways. The NCTE survey, for example, has gone specifically into, I believe, yes, it was, specifically into difficulties which affected Black trans communities. As we can see here, just some statistics, 42% of Black respondents experienced homelessness at some point compared to 30% overall. Increased amount, 67% said they would feel uncomfortable talking with the police, and consider that's 2/3 of all Black trans respondents. And then 41% of Black respondents experienced some type of psychological distress, more than 8 times the rate of the US population as a whole. Aya Damons, who works with Baltimore Safe Haven, which is a local organization that serves trans people with food, shelter, and quite frankly, anything that they could need in Baltimore, has said that it's often uncomfortable for Black trans women in Baltimore to just have a normal job or a normal life. Trans women of color face a barrage of societal hurdles, including elevated rates of murder, substance abuse, addiction, and health problems, which is what led Aya to found her group, because she knows the depth and urgency of these types of problems in Baltimore. And these are just some more statistics going over. It's a little bit small on my screen.
No worries, I can jump in. I probably can see it better since I'm sharing it. And so these ones are pulled out from that specific NCT report that talks about Black trans people and how their responses maybe differed from the overall responses. And so this is a table. The first one is about unemployment. And so you can see there percentage of Black people in the US Trans Survey that reported being unemployed was 20%. And then you can see the percent overall was 15. And then you see if you break it down, so Black people, it was 20%. For white folks in the US Trans Survey, it was 12%. And then you see the overall US population that's even less than that. And so again, it kind of reiterates the importance of really making sure you're taking into account various identities that somebody has and brings at the table in terms of what their experiences are. And just to show you this, since Mackenzie talked a little bit about AYA already in Baltimore Safe Haven, which we definitely could not recommend enough. They're wonderful, doing really amazing work. This mural here, it says Black Trans Lives Matter. And this is actually, I believe, from 21st to 23rd Street. It was on Charles Street in Baltimore City. And this was done, I believe, sometime in the summer last year in 2020 to really just, bring about the issue of not only Black Lives Matter, but the importance of trans folks in the movement and the importance of making sure we do not forget about Black trans people and the murders and horrible statistics that you hear. And so I recommend that you definitely learn more about them. Even if you're not in Baltimore City, they're a great resource and provide a lot of different things. And of course, we have to at least mention the pandemic and COVID because that's the reality. And we're almost, believe it or not, I just had this revelation that it's almost been a year since we have been working remotely for the majority of our time. And that's very wild for me to think about. And so, of course, a lot of data has shown that murders of trans folks have spiked during the pandemic. And so you will see here around 44 trans people were recorded as murdered in 2020, which is a huge rise from around 25 folks who were reported murdered in 2019. Now, you might think that that number sounds really small. And again, this is talking about the US specifically. And I think it's important, when we see statistics like that to know that when a community is so small, and when you think about the fact that trans people make up about 0.6% of the overall US population from a few years back, might be a little bit more than that now, these add up over the years. And so it is really important. And again, this is only just recorded deaths. This is not counting folks who might not have been out or who were misgendered or not named appropriately when they were killed. And so they were not really seen as being trans. So there's a lot lacking in that as well. Not only that, but, overall, I think, COVID has had an impact in terms of reports of domestic violence and unemployment, but we're seeing that exacerbated in the LGBTQ plus community. And a lot of different service providers or typical safe places, have had, different types of openings have closed a little bit, even just thinking of like coffee shops, for example. I love Red Emma's in the city. If you've never been there, it's a lovely place. They obviously have had a modified schedule and they have acted as a safe place for a lot of queer folks. And so having a lot of those be changed a lot or closed down for a bit, it really leaves a lot of support places lacking for LGBTQ plus folks. And this doesn't even go into the effects of COVID that, in terms of LGBTQ plus youth, and in terms of rates of depression and feeling isolated. There's a lot of unfortunate impacts that COVID has had on our community.
All right, so if anyone was following the news last year, in the summer of 2020, the Supreme Court handed down the 6-3 decision of Bostok versus Clayton County. This was a case dealing with Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, essentially debating whether or not being LGBTQ plus would protect someone from employment discrimination. And so Bostok, I believe, was Mr. Bostok, who was a gay man. There were two other associated cases, another cisgender gay man, and then a transgender woman, Amy Stevens. These three cases collectively, all of them had been fired from their job on the basis of, according to their employer, because they were either gay or transgender. When this went to the Supreme Court essentially said, look, the statute says that you're not allowed to discriminate against someone on the basis of sex or because of sex. And what the court essentially did was it said, well, look, with regards to the two gay men, they said, well, look, had these two gay men been women, the fact that they liked men would not have caused their employer to fire them. Therefore, it was merely the fact that they were assigned male at birth, their birth sex was male, which was the reason they were fired. This violates the statute. They came to a similar conclusion with Ms. Stevens' case, where they said, look, she was presenting female in her workspace. She was wearing the women's uniform. She was using she, her pronouns. Had she not been assigned male at birth, had she been assigned female at birth, then she would not have been fired. Therefore, this was discrimination because of sex. It is a remarkably simple way that the court came to that conclusion. Now, the decision was limited because it only applied to Title VII, which is specifically employment discrimination. So something that they discussed at oral argument is they did not address, for example, bathroom discrimination or school discrimination or other federal laws. So the implications of Bostok are still being litigated in other courts. Various questions that they have to answer is whether or not that same logic, the because of sex, applies under Title IX of the which is education discrimination, whether or not it applies to the Affordable Care Act. And something else that's being discussed and debated in those courts is whether or not the being transgender is a protected status or a quasi-protected status under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And I will say a few of the cases which have come down recently in the Fourth Circuit, Gavin Grimm, who you might have heard of, versus Gloucester County School Board, and out in the 11th Circuit, which I think is, I can't remember which state, Adams versus the School Board of St. John City. Both of those cases dealt with transgender men students at high schools or middle schools where they wanted to use the men's restroom. And in both cases, the Federal Circuit Court held that Title IX did protect them and said that the school's policies that they could not use the bathroom for their gender identity was a violation of Title IX. It was a violation because of their sex. And in addition to that, they held that being transgender is a protected status or a quasi-protected status under the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. And in addition to that, under the Affordable Care Act back in 2020, the Trump Department of Health and Human Services had attempted to read the opposite into the Affordable Care Act and essentially say that doctors could discriminate because someone was transgender. In essence, if someone walked into a hospital and said, hey, I have a broken arm, the doctor could say, I'm not going to treat transgender people, and wouldn't be liable under the Affordable Care Act. So I believe a day before that rule was going to go into effect, a judge in the Eastern District of New York in Walker versus Azar held that because of Bostok, he put a hold onto that new rule. And once the Biden administration came in, I believe they overturned that, but Ezra is going to talk to you a little bit more about that on the next slide.
Yes, I am. All right. So what's funny is is that we've done similar presentations like this one in the past. And I think the last time we did a presentation like this was early January. So Biden had already been elected, but not sworn in quite yet. And it's just kind of amazing, honestly, to prepare for this one and be able to make this slide a completely different slide than what it was, just really a month ago. And so this used to be a slide that said, here's some kind of depressing Trump administration things about the community. Whereas the Biden administration has already been extremely active when it comes to LGBTQ plus rights. And so some of these here, there's a link at the bottom that would give you information on all of these, but you could also, if you're curious about one in particular, search that title in quotes and you will be able to find the full text of that pretty much on the White House website. And so these are just some examples from really just about his first week in office, like January 20-ish is where all of these were kind of signed. So the first one there, you see it says preventing and combating discrimination on the basis of gender identity or sexual orientation. So this was an executive order that President Biden signed on the 20th of January, and that ordered all federal agencies to fully implement the US Supreme Court decision on Bostok, which Mackenzie had just talked about. And so that is one of the things that you can read more in detail about what that means. And on the 26th of January, so just 6 days after that one, Biden, he published a memorandum. And so that one was called Redressing Our Nation's and the Federal Government's History of Discriminatory Housing Practices and Policies. And so this one ordered the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, to examine various rules that have to deal with this and have been subject to regulatory actions. And so if you read that, they talk a lot about how, they really do acknowledge the fact that there have been barriers to affordable housing, safe housing for the LGBTQ plus community. And so it is really great to see this kind of recognition written by the president immediately after being in office. And then finally, on the 25th, Biden signed an order called Enabling All Qualified Americans to Serve Their Country in Uniform. And there's a bunch of different things that's also covered in that as well. But in short, it required all military branches to establish a process for trans service members to transition while serving. It also prohibited involuntary separations or discharges on the basis of gender identity. And it made sure to identify and reinstate service members who were involuntarily separated, discharged, or denied reenlistment based on gender identity yet again. And so there was also a lot of guidance in there for military folks to kind of look into to see how to implement this. And it also provides for a 60-day progress report on all of the directives outlined. So that is just within, like, all of these three things happen within 6 days. And so this, if you were just curious in terms of, really learning more about what the Biden administration is trying to work on, I definitely recommend you check these out. There also have been a lot of different, some would consider maybe smaller things that Biden has done as well to support the LGBTQ plus community. And I'm talking even as small as implementing pronouns on the White House's website as if you're filling out a form to contact them, which is super small but meaningful. Also, appointing various LGBTQ plus community members to positions in the government, such as Dr. Rachel Levine. Really, it is really an interesting time to be looking at all of these laws and to see what the US is doing in terms of LGBTQ plus rights. And honestly, I anticipate it to continue to change a little bit. I expect the next time we give a talk like this slide might also look very different yet again with various laws to change. And so now I'm going to pass it back over to Mackenzie to give us a little bit more of that statewide level to this rather than federal.
Yeah, so the federal government's one thing. Different states also have different rules and different levels of protection for transgender individuals. As of right now, 24 states, which includes Maryland, and I think Virginia may have just joined this number, offer some state level protections for transgender people. So even when the Trump administration was still in office and had rules such as discrimination is allowed or employment discrimination is allowed, et cetera, these states still offered state level remedies. So you may not have been able to sue in federal court, but you could have sued in state court. On the flip side, this is a map of the other states. Specifically, this is a map of states that have current legislation in progress or being voted on, which is classified as anti-transgender by the Equality Federation. Most of the legislation in these states deals with sports. Some of these include making it a crime, meaning that children could be sent to jail for if trans youth play on the sports team that aligns with their gender. Many of these laws would also permit, once you actually read them, would permit genital inspections and genetic testing of juvenile girls, cisgender or transgender, who want to play sports. So there's a lot of nasty implications from those laws. Other types of laws include forcing teachers to out their transgender students to their parents, even if they know that the student hasn't come out to their parents because it could present a dangerous situation. I believe some laws are trying to protect conversion therapy, so prevent local bans on conversion therapy. One of the more insidious ones is in Alabama. It just passed to their state Senate today, which would make it a felony to get trans affirming care for anyone under the age of 18. So any doctor who follows the international standards of care for transgender youth could be punished with up to 10 years in prison for that. So that's a very serious thing that's not getting a lot of coverage in the news right now. Other than that, there's just a lot of general bills making it more difficult for trans people to change their identity documents. So despite the progress that's being made at the federal level, there's still a lot of attacks going on at the state level, which can make life, to say difficult for trans people is possibly underselling it. To go back to some good news, on the Maryland specific side of things, we have managed to make a fair amount of progress, especially in the last few years. I'm not going to name and go through every single one of these bullet points, but these are just some examples of trans-friendly legislation that we have in Maryland. For example, we already had prohibitions on discrimination in healthcare and health insurance. So even when that Trump health policy was threatening people, the Maryland trans community would have been relatively protected. We last year, or I guess it's 2021 now, so the year before that, we were able to change the law to get the X gender marker onto licenses. In addition to that, I don't think we have it listed here, part of that bill was also to allow for self-identification on driver's licenses. So the process to change your gender marker on your license is a lot less strenuous than, say, your security card. Other things, bans on conversion therapy, easier to get birth certificates, second parent adoption is allowed. The others I think are pretty self-explanatory at this point. So Ezra, I think I'm going to hand it back to you for the next slide.
All right.
Or at least the first half.
You got it right. All right. So not to bring it back to a downer, but just to really show you the things that we have to do still, even though Maryland, for example, is, as you saw from the previous slide, and in comparison to the states that had active anti-trans bills in legislative session, we still have a lot of work that we're working on personally at Free State, but also just in general that we can be doing. So you'll see at the top here, you'll see some pending legislation that's happening right now, and what we're working on with policy advocacy initiatives. And you'll see that there's a little plug for checking out our policy tracker on our website. So we have on there a few different things that you can look at, including a table that has the bill information. You'll see the actual number for the bill. You'll see what it is in general. You'll see when the next hearing is scheduled for it, where it's at in the process, all of that information, just to give you a snapshot. If you're interested in that, you will just go to our website. Under the column, it says what we do. Under there, there's policy session 2021, you should be able to see. And you'll be able to see that information. You'll be able to see a calendar so you can track various bills and when their hearings are, and copy it on your own calendar. And then just again, kind of a description for each one and why we're supporting it as well. And so just I won't talk about all of these right now, but one of those is talking about simplifying the name change process, making it a bit easier. So if you have ever changed your name or have thought about it, there is something that is called where you need to publish notice of your name change. And oftentimes it's in at least one paper that's in local circulation in your area. And so that could be like a newspaper, for example, or an online newspaper. And there are a lot of issues that come with that in terms of safety and various things, but also the fact that it also delays the name change process quite a bit as well. So really in an effort to simplify that and also not put any trans and non-binary people at risk from, for example, family members that are not supportive, finding out about it without them wanting them to find out about it. This is one of the things going on right now. And then we also have just one that I definitely want to explain just in case somebody doesn't know what this is, but eliminating the gay and trans panic defenses. And so what that means is there is a defense that has been argued multiple times, sometimes successfully, where somebody, let's just paint a scenario of, so let's say somebody goes on a date with a trans woman and the person doesn't know that she's trans until maybe they're getting intimate or she discloses it, and the person panics, and in that panic decides to kill the trans woman or hurt her in some way. This is an actual defense that people have used to get a lesser charge rather than, for example, like first-degree murder. It would get something, you can get something less because you just kind of go in a blind panic or rage, and you don't, you're outside of yourself. So even just describing it, I know for me personally, I think that it's just a wild defense and completely inaccurate and should not be used. And that's definitely what we at Free State agree with that, and think that it should not exist as a defense. And so that's just another example of some pending legislation that we've been working on actually for at least a few years now. So if you're interested in seeing more, definitely go to our website to find that information so you can kind of keep track on what's going on this year. And then I'll let Mackenzie talk a little bit about some of these future goals that we have.
Yeah, so this is just a kind of the wish list for things that we would like to accomplish in the near and some of these far future. That first one there, modernizing family court procedures and surrogacy laws. The legal system, and especially the family court system, is built around assumptions that the people in it are going to be heterosexual and cisgender. As a result, it doesn't always know how to deal with or how to rule when queer families become involved. Queer families often look different. Couples may not have gotten married if marriage wasn't available for most of their relationship. Only one parent might be on a birth certificate, or any number of issues. One example, last year, there was a case, Sherman v. Rouse, where the couple had a Vermont civil union and then had moved down to Maryland, and one of them was seeking a divorce from the other. And there was a whole question about whether or not there was even a procedure in Maryland to get a divorce for a civil union. And ultimately the court ruled that they could get it just a form of divorce through the marriage courts of the Vermont Civil Union in Maryland. Um, on top of that, transgender individuals also face a heightened risk of discrimination in custody matters, where conscious or subconscious transphobia can affect decisions. I'll say from personal experience, I have a friend who went through a divorce, and their ex partner had been bringing in a lot of evidence, trying essentially to argue that they should get full custody of the children, essentially because my friend was transgender. So these aren't abstract things, these are occurrences which do still take place in court. Some other things we would like to do: create seniors' bills of rights to protect older LGBTQ individuals. A lot of times there's a risk, especially if you haven't gone through the process of legally changing your name, or if you have parents who aren't necessarily affirming. Basically ways to just make sure that things don't default to the parents, or let homophobic or transphobic parents get to say what happens with you, how you're buried, what name goes on your tombstones, things like that. And just quickly burning through some of the other bullet points. A lot of transgender healthcare requires some very burdensome requirements, getting letters, seeing multiple therapists. Insurance providers can sometimes throw up a lot of hoops that you have to jump through just to get care. We'd like statewide policy protecting trans students, just in case the legislation and the court cases don't go our way. Intersex individuals, when they're born, are often forced to go through surgeries that they might not have consented to had they been older, or had they been able to give consent. Legal loopholes around employment protections. We still have at-will employment in a lot of the US. So even with the Bostok decision, people can still be fired so long as the employer finds literally any other reason to fire them that isn't that they were trans. And criminal justice reform as well. It's a lot of prisons don't know what to do with trans people, and often there are no good options. And so at times, the only thing really to do would be to reform the criminal system from the foundation up, so that these problems simply aren't coming up and don't need to be dealt with.
All right, so we just threw a ton of different things at you. And so hopefully, even if you are watching this right now and not the recording, hopefully you go back to the recording at some point so that you can see all of the various resources we shared, names of different bills and executive orders that have happened, just so you can get a sense to really wrap your head around the state of things. I feel like I always have something to learn every time we do this. I feel like I'm reminded of something else. So please be sure to check that out again. You will also see on here both of our email addresses. Please do reach out if you do have questions that you don't feel comfortable with asking here, or maybe you think of them later. Please do send either one of us an email. We'd be happy to provide resources, whatever you really need. We're hoping to also be a part of this again sometime in the future and talk more about very specific things. And so I know Ash will be following up with more of your feedback through a survey that will ask about, what kind of future topics you'd like us to talk about, whether you want us to focus specifically on healthcare pertaining to the LGBTQ community, or employment, or if you want us to talk about the name and name change process, what that looks like, identity documents in general. We'd be more than happy to come back to have that conversation. And so while I say thank you, I also am going to take a moment to see what popped up in the Q&A there, and say that we have plenty of time. We have a few minutes right now. If y'all have any questions that we can answer now, revisit information, whatever it is, please feel free to think about it and drop it in the Q&A. Let's see. This person
looks like we have one from Kat.
Yep. Name change publication waiver bill was approved by the House at the end of January, right? So now it's heading to Senate voting. That sounds right, but I will be honest, I am not the main person doing the policy work at in our office right now. Our executive director, Jeremy, he has been, bless his soul, he has been very much in the thick of it at all of those meetings. That does sound right, but don't quote me on that. It is moving along. Mackenzie, I don't know if you had any confirmation other than what I just provided for that.
I'm trying to remember if, because you have to go through like 3 readings of the bill. I wish it were more simple.
Yeah, it really, yeah, and that's the wild
I'm on our
/ fun
page.
thing.
I'm trying to find the
Yeah, doing the sleuthing behind the scenes to answer this. Yeah, and that's the thing about policy advocacy in general, is that there is so much, there's so many moving pieces, and every bill goes to various committees and gets heard multiple times. And not only that, but some of these bills that we're working on this year are repeats from last year because the pandemic shut down legislative session early. So to say it's been wild is a very big understatement. So apologies for not having that full answer for you. We'll let Mackenzie do a little bit of sleuthing and see if she finds the official answer to that.
Am I muted? Silly question to ask.
No, you're not. I can hear you. No, that's a regular Zoom question.
True. So the waiver of publication change, it looks like we do not have another House hearing on it. So, and we do have a Senate hearing on it. So I'm tempted to say that yes, it is in the Senate right now.
See that? Policy tracker, another plug for that.
The last thing we have on here is that there was a Senate hearing on February 26th.
Okay. So yes, I'm curious of what the next steps are if they've been announced. It's also been kind of wild in terms, if you've ever been involved in policy advocacy, sometimes things will just wait for a little bit for the next steps. And then let's say today you'll get an email and it'll say, okay, your date is 2 weeks from now for the next hearing. Or it could be, okay, in 2 days or 1 day, it'll happen tomorrow. And then you kind of have to spring a whole bunch of people into action. So it has been, I think the transition to Zoom has been a very wild one for everyone. So things change very quickly, but thank you for asking that, Kat. And thank you, Tracy, for saying that it's been very informative and talking about the legislative updates. I appreciate you for saying that and checking those out. Any last questions folks have? Feel free to put them in there.
Yeah, we have a few. Oh, someone has, what can we do to advocate for law and our policy change? That was actually going to be the question I was going to pose as well. What do you think is the most effective way for people to be involved in advocacy?
That is a fantastic question. And I think there are a lot of different ways, and it really depends on what you're comfortable with as well. So if you're somebody who's new to policy advocacy and you just want to kind of get used to it, you know, honestly, it can't be understated the importance of just sharing information and just whether that's over Facebook or Instagram or Twitter. That is, as simple as that is, sharing information about policy initiatives, that is advocacy right there in itself. Now, if you really want to get more involved in this, for example, you can reach out to us and we can connect you with that. One of the bigger ways as well is writing testimony. So because everything is over Zoom this year, a lot of the policy advocacy, there are only about 3-ish people who can provide oral testimony in a Zoom room for each hearing, which means that that's way less than usual. Last year and other years, tons of people would show up and they would take as many people as were there and as long as they could be open, they would have people talk and share their own personal stories. We lost a lot of that this year due to COVID. So written testimony has become super, super important for providing that extra support that we're losing out of in terms of oral testimony. So that's like a number one way, you know, especially right now, that would be super helpful to advocate for. But of course, reaching out to us, to other organizations that you care about, we oftentimes have ways that you can be involved outside of those two specific things, whether it's helping, you know, write share emails with folks, whatever it is. There are different ways that we can kind of connect you with to learn more if you're interested. So thank you for that awesome question. And I see somebody, go ahead.
Not to belabor the point, but as far as just sharing information, I remember at one point in time, I got a text right around the time the Trump healthcare rules came out, which were trying to permit discrimination. I got a text from my mother, and she basically like trying to console me and asking me questions about it. But she'd only found out because my younger brother, who is one of the best allies I know, I'll be quite honest, had specifically reached out and was like, hey, I want to make sure that you're aware of this thing that's happening. And so I can't really underestimate the effect of just making sure that the knowledge is out there. Like those rules in Alabama, a lot of people just haven't heard about.
That is such a great point. I feel like we oftentimes try to overlook it and try to do other things, but honestly, information sharing is number one. So thank you for sharing that, Mackenzie. And I see somebody also ask, how do you see gender fluid topics fit within the gender expansive and non-binary categories of presentation and identification? And does that surface as a topic in your legal work? So I would say the term gender fluid, I would say if we're going to put it somewhere, it's really, I think a lot of times, and correct me if I'm wrong, Mackenzie, on this, a lot of times it's kind of nestled under the small umbrella of non-binary, or sometimes in the overarching umbrella of trans. But really, I think it's also similar in many ways. I think that's a kind of the problem with a lot of terms, is that they're so similar but slightly different. And so gender fluid could be somebody who maybe one day is going as a more masculine name and using he, him pronouns, and then maybe for the next day using she, her pronouns and a more quote unquote traditionally feminine name, or it can be any mixture of that. So it's almost similar also as non-binary in a lot of senses as well. And I think that I'm going to let Mackenzie ask about answer the part about the legal work one, since you're the attorney here.
So as far as I've not personally dealt with it being a problem or any type of special issue in legal work, typically it's just a matter of what the person wants to accomplish and basically talking with them and walking them through their options. Like you can update your gender marker on X, Y, and Z document to either M, F, or X. You can legally change your name, etc., things like that. And just working with them and finding out what they would like to do and what legal goals they want. But as far as having to use the word gender fluid in court, I don't think I've had to yet.
What is 801? Some really great questions. If anybody has any further questions that come up, again, of course, contact FreeState Justice. They'd be happy to help you. I am going to be sending out an email to registrants with a survey that's like standard for our classes, as well as just a very short one with, feedback specifically for future topics related to this work from Free State, or if you want to have like something, other types of LGBTQ related classes and events, you can put that there as well. And again, thank you so much, Mackenzie and Ezra, for being here tonight. Thank you to everybody who's been in attendance. If there's like any last comments or, urgent questions, feel free to speak now. Other than that, I hope everybody has a really great evening and stay safe.
Thank you all so much again. Number one, Howard County Library System for having us, and number two, for y'all being here. Again, reach out anytime if we can be helpful, and provide that feedback in the survey that you get. That'll be super helpful for future events.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you both to Howard County Library for having us and for everyone for sitting with us for this past hour plus.